So we have a change of scene because we're moving in to the first of our 4 topic areas, disability. And this is part 1 of a 3-part series on disability. I cover how we got to define disability in a particular way and what Cinderella and her ugly sisters have got to do with it. There's been a massive amount of time, energy and money that's gone into defining disability, but we're still mostly confused about it. We can't even agree what to call it. There's lots of different labels that people use, and those labels are contested, transient and culturally specific. We have people with disabilities, people with impairments, the differently abled and disabled people. We also have different labels for people who are not disabled, such as the non-disabled and the able-bodied. So it's all really confusing. Now, a lot of people use the term people with disabilities because they think it's a respectful label, as it puts the person first. You know, we should see the person before we see the disability. And the term disabled people is seen as a tad offensive. But people are wrong about this. Disabled people is the term commonly adopted by the disability movement as it reflects the social model of disability. The term people with disabilities reflects the medical model of disability. And I'll tell you more about those 2 models in part 3. Now, most social statistics on this are shaky. Bear in mind, we can't even define it properly yet, so how are we going to count the numbers? But I'll give you some of the most commonly cited statistics. So in Australia, it's believed that there are around 4.4 million disabled people. That's around 18% of the population. The World Health Organization cites a number of 1.3 billion disabled people worldwide, which is around 16% of the global population. And 80% of those disabled people live in economically disadvantaged societies, also called developing nations. And we'll come to that point in part 2. Disabled people are generally seen as bad, or as having had something bad happen to them. There's something wrong with them. They're seen as a problem. But this hasn't always been the case. For most of human history, it appears disabled people were kind of respected. There's the famous story of Nandy, a Neanderthal man who had multiple impairments. Archaeologists discovered him buried in a way that suggested he held considerable respect in his community. And disabled people were valued in various ways pretty much up until around about the 18th and 19th centuries, after which time things changed dramatically. And we can see this in the fairy tale Cinderella by the brothers Grimm. It was written in the early 1800s. You'll know it is the story of a beautiful young woman who marries her handsome prince despite the trickery and deceitfulness of her ugly sisters. Ugly in this case, meaning facially disfigured. What you might not know is that in Grimm's original story, the ugly sisters facially disfigured themselves to be more attractive to the prince. Now that sounds odd, but in those days, disability was experienced as something sensual, exciting and attractive. But that put them at odds with the medieval church that sought to control the masses and maintain authority through, among other things, the repression of sexuality. And that oppression was done first by constructing binaries that reinforced differences between disabled and non-disabled people, then shaping stories to cast disabled people as bad. And that then allows you to do things to disabled people, bad things to disabled people, without people caring much about it at all. First you separate, then you denigrate, and finally you subjugate. Divide, malign, then rule. The malign bit happens through the control of people's stories. You hijack people's stories, you pervert them, and then you hand them back so that the stories people share do the job of maligning the group you want to control. And you do it long enough and consistently enough, and eventually people will forget the original stories, just like what happened with the story of Cinderella. That's how you change culture. You get people to forget things. And as Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist, said, the struggle against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. But the church didn't do this alone. It was helped by a shift in the socioeconomic environment that started with the first industrial revolution in the mid to late 1700s. And that was when a focus became on physical bodies having to meet the needs of industry, to be able to work in the harsh conditions of the new factories. And not only were certain groups of people excluded from these new factories because they didn't fit, but those conditions of work in those factories were so harsh that it led to people being maimed and becoming disabled. Mass production and industrialization created new populations of disabled people, people who were excluded from and those maimed by those new forms of employment. We'll talk more about that in part 2, when we consider the major causes of disability. But it wasn't just industrialization combined with religion. It was also the institution of medicine that combined with these forces to further class disabled people as a problem. It was around about the early 1800s that medicine gained a lot of power, largely through chalking up some major public health successes through treating the infectious diseases that spread following the mass movement of people from rural settings to cities to take up jobs in the new factories. And that resulted in overcrowded housing and poor sanitation in these rapidly swelling cities. And medicine brought with it a focus on fixing what was wrong with people. You don't go to your doctor unless you think there's something wrong with you. And it was here that the cure or care approach came in to radically change how disabled people were viewed by society. So religion, industrialization, and medicine combined and proved an unstoppable force in relation to the dramatic shift in cultural norms around disabled people. Disabled people turned from being valued to being pathologized and pitied. Many became incarcerated because they were seen as no longer being able to make a useful contribution to society. And this work on reshaping social norms is an ongoing process. We see it happening today. Every time a child who begins their life not finding anything abnormal or unsettling about disability, they just find it interesting, by the age of 11, they start seeing disability as being something that's gone wrong with a person and as something that's a bit unpleasant. It's that ongoing reshaping of social norms to stop us valuing disabled people. And psychology plays its part in this. We pathologize disabled people, most notably through adopting diagnostic systems and measures of individual difference and classification of human behavior that both exaggerates the difference between people and gives those differences the gloss of appearing scientific and objective and as somehow natural rather than inferred. And that push to cast disabled people as the other and to pathologize their differences has been all-consuming in how it's imprinted into our culture, with the abundance of negative portrayals of disabled people. Things are changing. It's a slow change. It's largely through the efforts of the disability movement, helped by a generational shift whereby people are becoming more positively orientated to difference and diversity. But we still see negative portrayals of disabled people everywhere, much of it old, some of it new. Here's a quote that I like that came from Shari Thurer in a paper called Disability and Monstrosity. I'll put the full reference in the description box on YouTube and on the Moodle site for week 4. So here's the quote. Dr. Frankenstein's organ transplant and Dr. No's iron fist quite naturally generate a special propensity for monstrous behavior. Of course, the symbolic properties of disabled people are not exclusively learned, though they often are. The point is that physical deformity in literature and art is almost never unencumbered by the trappings of metaphor. There are almost no average or ordinary, by the way, physically aberrant characters. But as I say, things are changing. And a lot of this change is due to the disability movement, but some of it is that shift that's been happening generationally. But there's also been a shift in the economic environment that's impacted this. And what we're seeing is corporations have started to see niche markets as potentially lucrative. And so they're starting to target their marketing towards previously marginalized groups. And that comes with an airbrushing. And they airbrush the groups. So they're airbrushing people like disabled people to make them look more attractive because they're the new consumers of the corporation's products. Naomi Klein writes about this powerfully in her famous book, No Logo. And with this shift, we've seen more and more disabled people put on our screens. But what is noticeable is how their impairments are rarely portrayed as just incidental. Mostly, their impairment is central to their role. And with this slow shift towards valuing diversity, we now have the legacy of bitter cripple, whose impairment has turned them nasty, now joined with the more contemporary super cripple, people who show extraordinary courage and abilities to overcome their impairment. And the super crip is starting to take over. The C. Jane report in 2019 found that in TV drama programs, 1 in 5 characters fitted the super crip stereotype, while nearly 1 in 10 were portrayed as the bitter crip stereotype. So now we don't just have the category of subhuman open to disabled people, we also have the category of superhuman. But both categories still push disabled people to the outer bounds of the category human, just in different directions. And we're fooling ourselves to think we've turned a corner. We're having to push back on over 200 years of concerted effort from powerful institutions to make us think disabled people as wrong in some way. And that's produced a lot of cultural debris that needs sweeping up, with more debris spewing out every day. That negative iconography of the past still living with us today. Darth Vader, Dr. Evil, the Joker. They are modern day ugly sisters. And disability remains a metaphor for something bad and something to be pitied or feared. See how many of those metaphors you can still spot in film and TV of today. That's your homework. Okay, so that's the end of part 1. In part 2, we're going to look at the sort of discrimination faced by disabled people, and we're going to look at what causes impairment. So till then, ta-da.